Welcome to the launch of Death by Column Inches by Penny Kot. We dare not record this ferret intro from the ferret house, because Wriggles and Scruffles must never know. The ferrets attached to this book were trained criminals. Sheridan Hawes, a very bright 11-year-old from a chaotic, broken home, was fascinated when his big brother Wayne acquired 2 ferrets. Wayne had an unfortunate bent towards drug dealing and housebreaking, and it was not a love of animals that persuaded him to get ferrets. He's heard they could be trained to carry drugs and help him gain access to locked buildings. In his rare good moods, Wayne boasted to Sheridan about his exploits and taught him some tricks of his trade. In his usual frame of mind, he doled out kicks and cuffs when he wasn't ignoring his little brother altogether. Alas for Wayne, he was nowhere near as bright as his young half-sibling. His exploits caught up with him, and before the book even starts, he's already behind bars, and his ferrets have been rehomed. Sheridan, meanwhile, learnt discretion, as he took on board all Wayne's dodgy lessons. Oh, and he also ferreted out and hid some interesting paperwork prior to the police search of Wayne's home. Thus, the ghost of our Wayne floats through the pages of Death by Column Inches, but his ferrets don't appear. They're already off living happily ever after.
Death by Column Inches is a book that has been in the making since before Fantastic Books Publishing existed. It's one where the authors kept getting distracted by other projects and has never quite got it finished, until relatively recently. It's a crime novel with a difference, so not mainstream for Fantastic Books, but we have a good and growing crime list, and I just love anything that's quirky. You'll hear from the authors all about the long slog that made it such a long time from first draft to published book. Suffice for me to say, I'm glad it wasn't finished before FBP was up and running, because there was another publisher all ready to snap it up, and now we've got it. Why did I take this book? Well, because I loved it. I'll read you the prologue that sucked me in. Death by Column Inches by Penny Kot. Prologue. It is the autumn of 1992. In a few weeks, in her Christmas address to the nation, Queen Elizabeth II will refer to the year as her Annus Horribilis. Opinion is less clear as to levels of horribilis in other areas. Football fans are noisily divided over the newly created Premier League. However, the resignation of the England manager after his team fails to qualify for the 1994 World Cup is still a year away. As 1992 draws to a close, 32-year-old Martha Goodman has been 32 years old for over a year and will never grow any older, having been found lifeless on a riverbank in October of 1991. Neither her body nor her story made much of a splash, although the dog walker who found her noted the lack of footprints in the mud, something about which he would later claim to have been mistaken. With foul play ruled out, people murmured drugs, and the world moved on. For a nearby inner-city school, 1992 should truly have been an annus horribilis. National League tables have been introduced, and the school, colloquially known as Main Road, has publicly sunk to the bottom. Its head teacher, however, is feeling smug. His long tenure has crushed his ambition. Main Road was once to be a stepping stone to better things, but has left him as something of a maverick. He rules with an iron fist, championing his failing school, whilst treating with disdain the bureaucrats of the local education department, who privately discuss sacking him. He knows, as do they, that they won't find a replacement able to keep a lid on the chaos. During a staff meeting at the start of 1992, he outlines his plan to have the school reinstated in the Young Persons University scheme. An unfortunate incident in 1991 saw Main Road banned, but he feels the Education Committee can be coerced. To his surprise and secret gratification, his staff set to and generate creative project plans. One of them even conjures up a volunteer supervisor. He wonders if creativity has taken a step too far when, following a report that a young woman is to be charged in relation to the year-old death of Martha Goodman, her trial is suggested as a basis for a project. Most of them will end up in a courtroom, is the prevailing view, so they may as well learn how it works. Not everyone sees the forthcoming trial in a positive light, including the accused woman's older brother. His age will eventually outstrip his IQ, and the situation is hard for him to understand. He shares a birthday with his niece, the accused woman's daughter. Today is their joint birthday. She is 9. He is 42. Enjoy the rest of the launch video.
The origins of this book are partly lost in the fog and partly fragments of very clear memories. I have no idea of the order that it all came together into a plan for a book. I don't even know if I knew that at the time, but I suppose somehow or other it came together. I had the idea in the early 1990s. There was a good few years later than that it actually became a first draft of a book. Most of the threads within the book, if not all of them, are based on real stuff. So, for example, there was a case of a group of students investigating a murder case. It happened in the US. They were law students, I believe, possibly postgrads, who were doing something. There was some nuance of this case that was useful for the work they were doing. And they ended up finding the evidence that exonerated this guy who had been sitting on death row. So obviously it made the news a bit and caught my imagination. Now, I haven't followed that exactly in the book, and the students within the book are 11-year-old school children, and it's not a big substantive project, but they do follow a murder trial. Another thread would be hospitals. I've worked in hospitals across Europe over the years. In particular, I worked in one that was so old it was scheduled for closure and demolition, and I worked in another one that was so new it was still being built while I worked there. So the threads out of the new one, it was mainly the chaoticness of it. We were working in the medical school, which was up and running. The hospital bit, the main bit for patients, wasn't. There were a few patients coming into clinics round our bit, the medical school. But it was designated a hospital. It was a hospital. And therefore, if the fire alarms went off, the fire brigade would turn out very quickly and very fast and in force. And during the period where the huge tower block side of the hospital was being hooked up electrically and having its lifts done and heaven knows what else, the work crews there were constantly doing things that set off the fire alarms. I don't know, touching the wrong wires together, that sort of thing. I mean, in a couple of occasions, actually creating fires. And even when they'd done something by accident and they knew they'd set off a fire alarm and got straight on the phone to the fire brigade, it was always too late. And you can't fault them. They, like I say, they turned out in force and very, very quickly they were there within minutes. So where I was working, our lab overlooked one side, what was then the kind of main way into the site. It wouldn't be later. It was a side entrance once the hospital was up and running. But we were used to seeing fire engines arriving, people racing around in uniforms, swinging axes and doing whatever they do, which is quite interesting to watch. But we did get very blasé about the fire alarms. The things would go off and we would just shrug, oh, fire alarms again, somebody's touched the wrong wire. And we'd carry on working. I mean, there was one occasion I remember when it came to lunchtime, the fire alarms had been going on and off all morning. And we got to the lift. I think we were on about D floor on our side. It was a smaller building, the medical school. not like the big tower block, pressed the button for the lift. And when it arrived, doors opened, it was absolutely packed with firemen in uniform and carrying all their gear. And so we were a bit taken aback, but squeezed our way in, had a look at the buttons. Nothing had been pressed. They had clearly got in the lift on the ground floor, hadn't done anything, and the fact of us pressing the button from upstairs had actually summoned the lift with them all in it. So we politely said, well, what floor do you want? And they sort of looked at each other a bit shiftily. Then one of them said, right to the top, Q floor. So we said, not in here, you're not. We only go up to F. And so they all looked at each other again and raced off out and headed for the stairs and to try and find out where they needed to be. They did apparently eventually find a way into the tower block, but by the time they got to where they were going, the fire, and it had been a real fire that time, had been put out by the work crew who were all sitting around having their lunch. But that sort of thing was always happening. There was just an element of chaos and things being botched. And partly wasn't really surprising back then. The plans for that hospital were ancient. They'd been first drawn up before the Second World War, and they hadn't been substantially changed. They had had to bolt things on, like the electron microscopy department, where I worked for a while, because when the plans were made, there were no such things in hospitals. But it still had, for example, a scooter park. Its basement was a huge scooter park. Scooters, motorbikes had been the coming thing when the plans were finalised back in 40s, I think it probably would have been. And nobody had changed them. We used to joke about that because we had one solitary colleague in the medical school who came to work on a motorbike. And we would joke that he had the entire basement to himself. Although in fact he didn't, because they blocked off the entrance. And the entrances hadn't even been made wide enough for cars, so they couldn't turn it into a car park. It was a nightmare for parking. So what it brought home to me, I think, for this, in terms of the book, was not so much a lack of planning, but a lack of joined up thinking for a building like that back then, something that had been planned so long ago. Built, botched, things latched onto it and so on. Now, if I move from there to the very old hospital that I worked in, the one that was scheduled for closure and was demolished soon afterwards, that was a very different sort of a site. It was the old-fashioned hospital spread out across a large site, old-fashioned buildings, access was very difficult, Victorian stuff really, but it had a huge system of tunnels underneath it. If we were going to and from operating theatres, I mean, we might be carrying samples or chemicals or radioactive material or wheeling patients or whatever. You couldn't always go out into a thunderstorm if one was happening, so you'd go down via the tunnels, and they were interesting. They were very well lit, they were all beautifully tiled, very neat. They went everywhere, and they had lovely signboards at every corner, and thank goodness they did, because you could easily have got lost down there. Now, speaking of threads, it was the film Threads that was made in the mid-1980s, I want to say. I think that's right. And that hospital, after it had been closed, but before it had been demolished, it was used as part of the film set for Threads. And after Threads had been filmed, that was the film where the premise was about a nuclear bomb was dropped on Sheffield, and it was the aftermath of that. And that the empty hospital was used as the sort of chaotic, half-damaged hospital at the time. A group of us went back in and visited the hospital. I don't recall that we ever asked for permission. I think we were essentially urban explorers of the time, breaking our way into the site and going and having a look round. And it was fascinating because I'd worked there and knew parts of it well, to actually go in. It was also a bit creepy as well, because it was empty, it was dusty, dirty in a way that wasn't right from the hospital I remembered. But also there were bits and pieces from the film lying around. So there would be wads of cotton wool soaked in what looked like blood but was presumably dye, that kind of thing, and oddments of medical instruments that clearly hadn't been left from the hospital but had been left from the film. And we did try to go and visit the tunnels, and we didn't get very far. What I remembered as this brightly lit maze underneath the hospital, well, of course, it wasn't brightly lit anymore. There was no electricity to the site at all. It was pitch black. It had clearly started to deteriorate. There were tiles falling off the walls. We had torches, but we would come across things like the remains of a downward staircase, and all guardrails had gone, and it would have been so easily just one wrong step that you could have fallen down a substantial depth, and God knows what would have been down there. There were clearly rats and things mooching about down there. You could hear them scurrying. But, it would be quite a substantial fall. So we didn't actually explore far. But it was an interesting experience that sat in my mind, and it clearly found its way into the book too. Another thread would be the school children. I've been asked about that because the group of 11-year-olds are central to the plot of this book. Now, I've been a teacher most of my life, in mainly higher education. I've never taught in schools. I've never taught 11-year-olds, but I have interacted with 11-year-olds, obviously our own children, as they've grown up, and their friends and so on. But I've also worked with a lot of people who've worked in schools, including working as fairly informal volunteer helpers, such as the character Miss Leviston in the book. Now, these days, you wouldn't get into a school to become a helper who looked after children quite so informally or casually as you could back then, but indeed you could, and in the book she does. These are the children who are actually following a murder trial. And I have been asked about this. 11-year-olds can't go into a courthouse. Well, no, they can't. But back in 1993, as long as they were big enough to pass for 14, they could get into the public gallery, no trouble. And indeed, in the book, they only need to do that once because of the way it pans out. I guess the really concrete thread from there is actually the early 1990s themselves and the whole context of that. There were no mobile phones back then. Well, there were, but no, people didn't use them the way that we did now. School children didn't have phones. There was no internet in the way we use it today. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee proposed his magic, but it wasn't up and running back then. The whole business of connected networks had been around for a long time, largely starting off as a military tool and becoming an academic tool. I've had an email address since the mid-1980s, but most people in the early 90s didn't really know what email was about. It was a completely different world. The internet as we know it was at an embryo stage. And that echoed quite nicely against the children and the stage of development they were at. They were in a school that was classed as a failing school, because that's kind of what we decided was a good thing to do, apparently, back then. They brought out league tables, and some schools just plummeted right to the bottom. And they're in this sort of a school. So their school has been written off. Because they go to the school, they're largely written off. They do have problems. Some of them come from chaotic homes, broken homes. They have all sorts of difficulties. But some of those children, like ordinary children everywhere, are exceptionally bright and really shouldn't have these artificial restrictions put on them. But they are. Just, the school they go to, where they come from. We put these sort of glass ceilings, though that's not probably the right term. But we do it. We just stifle ambition. It's not a good thing. And it can backfire as well to turn your back on children who are very bright and actually want an outlet for their creativity. Anyway, at the time, back then, I loved epistolary novels, written all in letters, all in documents. I wish I didn't, or I wish I hadn't at that moment read a book that had been written in that way. And I know I must have done, because I absolutely loved the idea of writing a book all in documents. And I can't remember which book that would have been. And there have been some wonderful ones. But in terms of this particular story, that was a really, really bad idea. But I had it stuck in my head that that was how I was going to write this book. So I did. And I got the first draft written, as I say, it was some years after the initial idea had ever come to me. And I did unexpectedly get some professional advice on it quite quickly. I was at a writing conference and a publisher there made a presentation, and they were saying, in particular, they were looking for quirky crime. And whatever you could say about this draft that I'd written, however bad it was, it certainly was quirky crime. So I had a chat with the guy afterwards. I explained where the idea had come from, what I was trying to do. I did say that it was a draft and it wasn't anywhere near ready because I wasn't happy with it. At least I knew that much. But he did say, send it anyway, and I'm going to let my editor have a look and see what they say. So I did that, and I got back the wonderful feedback. I mean, no, they didn't take it, but they said basically they would like to take it when I'd sorted it out. They pointed to a particular thread story that goes through the book, the one that is very specifically tied to the group of children. That was perfect. The rest of it didn't work because of the way I'd written it. That was really useful feedback to get. They weren't, in a way, telling me anything I didn't know. I knew it didn't work. But if I hadn't had that unequivocal, this is not the way to write it, I'll bet I could have spent some months or years actually trying to polish what I have had and just getting nowhere with it. Anyway, great. That gave me the push to get started on a next draft written a completely different way. I mean, the times that this book has been thrown out and rewritten, I couldn't count over the years. The only bit that stayed the same is that initial thread. Anyway, then something came in from left field and derailed the whole project. I was by then writing the private investigator novels, and I'd written some, but I wasn't really getting anywhere with them. And then, just out of left field, one of them won a crime writer's dagger, and then suddenly they were flavour of the month. I found myself with a big agent and everybody wanting me to write more of these things, and I kind of just about got to the stage of thinking, well, this is not going to get anywhere. I'm going to put all these private investigators back in the cupboard and I'm going to concentrate on my quirky crime. But no, suddenly it was the other way around altogether. I did try and flag this other book to the agent. I explained what had happened. I said I thought it would be a really good book when it was properly written, and I was just starting work on it, and nobody was interested. The book hadn't got a dagger, so what was I talking about? Don't be so silly. Get on with the private investigator. So I went back into the world of private investigation, which is fine. I enjoyed doing that. And in the end, of course, the private investigator has had, I think, 8 outings. And over the years, I've occasionally got out the quirky crime book. had a look, had a rewrite, knocked it all together, but it's taken until probably about a year ago to actually get it in a form that I'm completely happy with, that all the threads seem to work. And the very last thing that I actually got right was how to start it, bizarrely. But finally now it seems to have a start, an ending, and all its various threads, all in the right sort of order. And finally it's going to see the light of day. Now, I've said about it being, originally writing it all in documents. It was in newspaper cuttings, letters, court transcripts, all sorts of stuff. Didn't work. Threw that out, but I didn't throw them all out. There were quite a few of the documents have survived. It's just that it is not now a book that is completely focused on that structure. So what I'm going to do now is read you one of the surviving documents. It's from Chantal Fletcher, who was one of the 11-year-old children. It's written on the 14th of October 1992. In the letter, she is talking about the YPU. That stands for Young Persons University. And the Young Persons University actually certainly was a real thing. It wasn't called that. It was called the Children's University, where universities would liaise with schools in an area, and they would come in and do projects with the children. And it was in primary schools, and it was very popular, very useful, did a lot of good work. It was not structured in any way like the way that I have structured the YPU in the book, but it was actually the germ of the idea for that. So here is Chantal Fletcher. Dear Auntie Frida, my mum has said to write you that I'm sorry you and Uncle Thomas wasn't able to come and visit and bring my birthday present, what with Uncle Thomas going into hospital with his diabetes. My mum brought me an extra present of notebooks. I'm right good at writing. Our school's on the YPU this year, what we got barred from after that trouble, but that wasn't nothing to do with me. Main Road ain't never had a civvy volunteer before. She's called Miss Leviston. She's Mr. Michael's girlfriend, and he's got her to do it. Me and Kate White got picked for her group. She's got this right good idea about us doing murder for our project. When you come a visit, can you not get me notebooks, because I've got enough now? I don't mind a Game Boy. I hope Uncle Thomas gets better soon from having his leg took off. Love from Chantal. But that's one of several documents that have actually survived the years, along with the threads that have now been put into good order. So anyway, 30 years. This book has finally escaped my clutches and made it out into the world. I could not be more delighted.
You've used a pseudonym before, but that was for a genre swap from crime fiction for adults to fantasy for children. This one is crime fiction, so why the change of name?
Well, because this book's been 30 years in the making, a lot of people have read it, either bits of it or early drafts, and two things have emerged over the years. One, it's a bit of a Marmite book. People either love it or hate it. I once bumped into the editor who gave me feedback on a very early version. It was at a conference, and it was several years after she'd seen the book. She recognised my name and, without prompting, remembered both the book and her favourite character in it, Chantal Fletcher. She could even quote some of the things Chantal had said. Now, for it to make that sort of impression on someone who read manuscripts for a living was amazing. It was one of the things that made me never give up on it. The other thing, and the other side of that coin, I found that the people who liked the Private Investigator series on the whole didn't much like this book. It wasn't universal, but there is an expectation that an author name will be attached to a particular type of book, especially after there have been several in a series. And though this is crime, it's totally not the same type of crime. So if someone dives in expecting something like the Annie books, they're likely to be put off, and I don't want to put my readers off. And so I agreed to the pseudonym. But you'll notice it's not a wholesale change. I do at least remain half me this time.
Do you envisage any further pseudonyms for any future books, say if you venture into new territory?
Well, I really hope not. I think I could start to lose track of myself. But there's lots of genres I've not dabbled in yet, so never say never.
Hello, this is Linda Acaster offering my review of Death by Column Inches, author Penny Kot. Taken into schools competition, a sink estate, a group of 11-year-olds from dysfunctional families, and a murder. This is no genteel Famous Five novel, neither is it a children's book. Set in the early 1990s, on the cusp of internet use, the children talk and write as they speak, ungrammatically and directly, their main focus international football and being ferried to the Alton Towers theme park. It is their inquisitiveness and the need to be taken out of their lived lives, not yet corrupted into cynicism, that touches those reading between the lines. In contrast, the adults, the non-teaching project leader and the manipulative journalist the children write to for information, it is they who soon find themselves out of their depth and on an unstable limb, whereas the youngsters use their street cred to create a solid wall of protection with very few chinks. Who is the murder victim? Who the repentant confessor to the crime? Whose side are the conspiracy theorists on? And who is paying the quietly spoken heavy with a direct line to a forger and a seemingly bottomless bank balance? This is a cracking tale of lives within lives, of deceit and cover-ups going back decades, and the resourcefulness of 11-year-olds intent on enjoying the delights of Alton Towers theme park.
Death by Column Inches by Penny Kot gripped me from the start. A group of 11-year-olds are at the heart of it. They're from a deprived area and they go to a failing school. Society has largely written them off, but that could be said of almost all the characters for one reason or another. The view we're given of this fictional world is from just 3 of the characters. So although we see the world through the eyes of 11-year-old Chantal Fletcher, we never get inside the head of her classmate Sheridan. This means we can't always see what Sheridan is up to, but it's clear he's up to something. Chantal isn't interested enough to show us. When we see through the eyes of the reporter, Robert, his selfish nature shines through, but his self-obsession makes him miss things too. He gets a jaw-dropping shock the day one of the children casually mentions a key name from his past, just when he thought he was safe too. And thirdly, there's Frank Bennett. We learn early on that his age will one day outstrip his IQ. He's in his early 40s as the book opens, and he stumbles through the story trying to do his best for his younger sister, but baffled that she seems to resent his efforts as much as everyone else does. There's a seam of resourcefulness in Frank, though, as long as he has a step-by-step plan to follow. The shocked incredulity of the people who've taken him for granted when they realise what he has done was a very satisfying scene. The story is set in the early 1990s, and there is a thread woven lightly through it that ties the early internet to the children on the edge of adolescence. The former is about to unleash massive disruption on the world, and maybe the children are set to do the same. I will say, though, that this book is not for everyone. If you want every last angle explained and every loose end neatly tied, this story might frustrate you. To my mind, the clues are all there to allow you to unravel the hidden agendas, the shenanigans that Chantal doesn't see, the things Robert misses, and the complexities that Frank can't understand. But there is no all-seeing detective swooping in to gather everyone together in the library to explain every nuance. You have to join the dots yourself. I could feel the book rising to a crescendo as the final page approached, and wondered how on earth it would end. I'm happy to say I found it an unexpected but wholly satisfying conclusion.